Well, good morning, everybody. I've just been reminded by Joan Player, our guest speaker, that I shouldn't talk too fast either. So I'm trying to avoid that. So welcome to the Mediators New Breakfast Club, and we'll follow the usual format. This is run as a Zoom meeting, so Martin, who's top left under RDB Chambers, can bring people in. We will do a bit of housekeeping at the end, and Dave Owen, who's my colleague and partner in crime, will invite people attending for the first time to introduce themselves. But we won't hold up Jane Player by doing that. We'll also talk about our next meeting in January. And obviously, this is being recorded and will be available for further viewing by people who either were or were not here. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Jane. Jane and I know each other for a long time, and we're both, I guess, fellow ADR specialists, third-party neutrals, mediators. And so Jane's going to talk about really how she got to where she is now, which sounds pretty exciting, actually, Jane. So over to you. If people want to jump in, then they can raise a hand like that, or flip it up at the bottom, or raise points on the sidebar on the right-hand side, and Martin and I can see those, and we can chip in. So, how many people have we got on, Martin, at the moment?
38 so far.
Jolly good and counting. So, welcome everybody, and Jane, over to you.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I recognise quite a few of the names, so really nice to see some of your faces again. Thank you for inviting me to speak. I feel quite honoured. I was saying to Michael, I remember coming along to the mediators' breakfast meetings when they used to be in a little pub in Fleet Street, and that was great fun. A long time ago now. But the ability to be able to get online and see people not just in the UK but elsewhere is really quite exciting, and I think it says an awful lot about how mediation has grown over the years. I thought it might be helpful for me to sort of break up my talk into three bits. Firstly, the history of how I got to where I'm now. Then, and part of that's the marketing that I did then and I continue to do. We all have to do it, unfortunately. We all hate it, but we have to do it. Then look at a couple of interesting cases, the stuff that I'm doing now, how it's changing. And then perhaps a little bit of a look into the future in terms of what I'm seeing from the meetings that I'm going to around where I think mediation will be going. Who knows? It's staring into a stargazing a little bit, but certainly my experience of the cases I'm now being involved with. So just to begin with, how did I get into mediation? Many of you might probably know my first law firm was Turner Kenneth Brown. Now, Turner Kenneth Brown no longer exists, sadly, but it was very, very long time ago. And whilst a baby lawyer, Eileen Carroll was my boss. And she brought CEDA into the UK and they set themselves up in our offices. So can you imagine, as a 2-year PQE, what fantastic experience that was? And I ended up doing a mediation in 1992 for Bechtel. Now, Bechtel, big construction company in the US, very much ahead of their time, had mediation in their clauses to say, when we have a dispute, we will mediate. So I ended up mediating with my boss at the time, Stuart Benson, this big hotel construction dispute in Barbados. Sadly, the mediation was not in Barbados. It was in Clifford Chance's offices. But it was a first experience of how mediation can resolve really big disputes amicably, putting relationships back on track. And that was exactly my beginning of my experience of mediation. But it was also, and more fundamentally, my training as a lawyer. And I think that's so fundamental. And it's happening, if you look at Mediator Academy and what they're doing in terms of training universities, we are now getting baby lawyers coming into law firms where mediation is mainstream. It's not alternative. It is the way you think about resolving disputes. And that makes such a big difference, it seems to me, in terms of why mediation, that combined with CPR and the government encouragement, mediation is now first and foremost in people's minds. So that was my TKB experience. In typical women fashion, I had 3 kids. I took 3 months, 6 months, and no maternity leave. But when I did my 6 months maternity leave, I decided to train as a mediator, and that happened in 2000. And then luckily, I went on to spend 10 years at DLA, becoming the head of London disputes. and then on to Bird and Bird for 10 years, where I was head of their international disputes groups. And during that time, I was very lucky, and I thank them very much that they enabled me to be a mediator alongside my litigation practice. Really think that was very useful for me because I knew what I was doing when I was an advocate, and I knew what I was doing when I was a mediator, and I appreciated the lawyer's role. And you all know as mediators, that's so, so important, because sometimes mediators feel that lawyers are in the way, get in the way of mediation, but recognizing their role and knowing how you've got to work with them and how you've got to help them their best in front of their clients makes the mediator's role much easier. So I really appreciated having that dual role for quite a long time. The end of my litigation career, if you like, led me into 5 years at a US law firm where I helped King & Spalding set up their litigation practice. Tom Sprange was already there as head of arbitration, and he wanted a litigation arm. So Sarah Walker and I from Bird and Bird went into King & Spalding and set up 9 partners and 42 associates over that 5-year practice. And the deal for me, if I'm honest, was I'll do that for you, but I want to be a mediator. So I'll set it all up. Very happy to do that. Sarah can stay on, but I want to jump off and become a full-time mediator, because it's quite a brave thing to do. For those of us that have done it, I find it very scary when you're used to being in a law firm and getting your either your wage or your dividend or whatever it's going to be every month, and knowing what you were going to get. Suddenly being self-employed and having to go out there and look for it was a bit scary. So having a bit of a buffer of a US law firm, thank you very much, was super helpful. So it worked both ways. It was good for us both. It also gave me a really interesting insight into US litigation, US mentality for dispute management. And because by then I'd also become an independent academy, the International Academy of Mediators member, I was also understanding much more how mediators worked internationally. And that's really fascinating, and has been one of my interests thereon in terms of understanding how, when you're going to mediate, how people will want you to mediate depending on their culture and the way that their dispute resolution mechanisms work in their countries. And we can go on to talk about that later. But if I think about my journey, having that ingrained in me as a junior lawyer around mediation being something we really need to think about when we're running our cases, being able to see it both internationally and nationally throughout my litigation 35 years, gave me a real, I think, stepping stone into being a better mediator, if I'm honest, and an ability to really, really understand the role everyone was playing in the mediation itself. So there I was in 2017, walked away from a US law firm. I think, if I'm honest, having had 35 years as a lawyer in a law firm, a partner for over 20 of those years, it was a real shock. And I thought I would join and be covered in mediations immediately. I was doing one a month, I think, as a litigator. I was working with IPOS and CEDA, and between them, they probably gave me about 12, 15 a year max. And that's probably all I could afford to do, because King & Spalding weren't very keen on me doing too much, because it wasn't very lucrative according to them, which I understand. But then trying to make that into a career was tough. And I wonder whether, I think as a mediator, we all have to have a few grey hairs to become a mediator and be taken seriously. But at the same time, we want to make it a practice. So how do we do that? How do we build that up? I've been talking to independent mediators chambers since 2014. The guy the clerk there, who knew me well, had been a clerk at Littleton with Michel Calapetis, as you know. He knew me, I knew him, and we were chatting a lot about I would be a good fit, but when. And they have a model where they only take 10 mediators, so you have to be asked, you have to be the right fit. It's quite a lot of courting for it to happen. When I jumped off, but in 2014, I was just going into a US law firm, so I couldn't join. And so I had to decline. In 2017, when I'd love to have done, they were full. They'd just taken on a new mediator. And with hindsight, that was the best thing that could have happened to me, because it meant I had 4 years of trying to build my practice myself, test myself out. And that sort of leaks into our marketing piece, where what do you do? And I think being a litigation lawyer is a help and a hinder, if I'm honest. I think it really, really helps because you've got a network of fellow heads of litigation throughout cities, certainly in the UK, that you can contact and say, look, now I'm a mediator, can we have a chat? They'll probably know you anyway. But I think it also hinders you in some ways because you've been their competitors. It was certainly difficult, I think, when I was in a law firm to be appointed as a mediator. When I was a litigation lawyer, it became much easier when I was no longer in a law firm. So you don't want to push yourself too hard, but you need to make sure people know that you exist. So I think I spent a good 18 months really trooping through the city, making sure people knew what I wanted to do now, understanding my experience to date, my relationships with other law firms, my abilities, my reputation, if you like, and building that up. And then in 2021, so during sort of lockdown and COVID, IM knocked on my door and said, look, we'd like you to join us. And that's been a game changer for me. I mean, it's been really quite remarkable. And from sort of, I suppose from 2017 to 2020, that 3 years, I built my practice up from about 15 to 20 mediations a year to 25 to 30, 30 to 40 mediations a year. And now, of course, we are so busy. My problem now is that I am meant to be semi-retired, as my husband keeps telling me, but I keep getting such really interesting cases that I can't stop can't stop working, and I love it, really, really love it. And I'm doing really interesting work, a lot of travel, and cases where I'm so excited, and I think we all are, to be a mediator at this time when there's so much emphasis on dispute avoidance and dispute management, where there's so much innovation around how mediation can help parties perhaps look at their relationships as opposed to their disputes in a better way, that we couldn't be mediating at a better time, it seems to me. And I think there's going to be more and more work for those of us that are keen and able. So I feel very, very lucky to have jumped off the litigation bandwagon, if you like, at just this time when there's just so much excitement and work to do. So that's the sort of the first about me is as an individual and how I got where I got to. I think the other lessons I took away from my background, because it's interesting to talk about whether everybody needs to be a litigation lawyer to be a mediator. Answer, absolutely not. But what does it help and what does it hinder? One of the things it does allow you to do, I think, is to really have empathy with the lawyer's role, to be careful not to step on the toes of advisors. I know judges and barristers struggle sometimes not to advise as mediators. We litigators do. It's part of our DNA. But once you step into the mediator's role, this ability to be the facilitator and to urge and nudge parties without actually telling them what to do is a real skill that we all learn and we all morph into, if you like. And yet the stats tell us that the parties want us to be interventionists. They want us to give indications. They want us to give directions. I used to call myself an assertive facilitator. What we mustn't do is run the sort of training we had and say, well, I can't possibly comment. That's not my role. It drives parties mad. We know that. So we learn that as mediators, that we have a role of the gentle nudging and the raised eyebrows when lawyers run arguments that you know and they know aren't really going to wash with a judge, to allow them to come on side with you in terms of what's the art of the possible today? How can we get you out of this litigation? What kind of deal would be better than what you're currently facing? So for marketing, of course, your performance is your best marketing tool. And it's interesting. And I think it's really important. And I ask every single time to all my lawyers who appoint me, can you give me some feedback? And I'm really open with them because, interestingly, I would say probably now, maybe because of the size of the cases I'm doing, maybe 25% of my cases now are not settling on the day. They're bigger, they need more work afterwards. That's an interesting trend, I think. And so I rack my brains when I don't settle on the day. What did I do? What didn't I do? What could I have done? What can I now do in the future if I'm staying on board to move the dial, to change the focus, to try to get us to talk in a slightly different way, to get us into settlement mode? And so by doing that, I will often reach out to the lawyers to say, would love to just have a brainstorm with you, not about the content of the day, but how I perform, what you liked and what you didn't like. And all of that feedback is really good for me, but also inevitably marketing. It's just sort of getting them to give you feedback in terms of how you've behaved. So I think that's really, really important. Obviously, being in a chambers helps you. I don't think I realised, having not been a barrister, just how collaborative a chambers is, just how wonderful clerking is for you. I had a few years doing my own invoicing, and it was wonderful to hand it off to somebody else to chase my bills and to make sure they were all paid on time. I think thought leadership's really, really important. I think you've got to be listening and reading around where mediation's going and contributing where you're able. I think it's really important. Having said all that, I think, visibility without 100 postings on LinkedIn every day is a good idea. I hear the feedback of those who are always, if you like, in your face, it goes down badly. So it's getting that balancing act between being not telling everybody what you ate yesterday, as opposed to telling people when you've really got a comment to make about where your views are about a particular subject or a particular case, or how mediation is moving, or what a country has said in terms of mediation. So sort of,
Actually, Jen, if I could just chip in there,
yeah.
I totally agree, because a lot of the time, I mean, I do a fair amount of posting on LinkedIn, but I try and avoid talking about myself all the time. And that's exactly what you're saying, isn't it? That a lot of people who post are people who talk a lot about, here I am having dinner in, well, what I was doing last week, Dubai. Here I am sitting around with a few of my mates, having a jolly nice time. We had a great party, and and actually, it really doesn't take you anywhere, I don't think. So I
Yeah.
think you're absolutely right.
I mean, I would say that there's a colleague of mine who does it brilliantly, Bill Marsh. When he comments, you really listen, you really read it. You're right. I mean, I really don't care. In fact, I think people say too much. People who are forever telling me where they are means they're probably not mediating. So it's a balancing act, and I mean, we all have our own style, and people see that from you. And I'm certainly not a shy flower. So I wouldn't say that, of course, you've got to do a little bit of self-promotion, but you've got to be thoughtful about it, mindful about what it is you're saying, and how useful a comment it is. Particularly, I think, in the world of social media. And I say that because I've just come away from last year doing an incredibly painful mediation for a family who lost a child because she had been influenced by social media and had taken her life. And the mediation was against the big Metas and the Instagrams of this world, who have a role to play in this. And we all know that. We've all been reading the papers around what they have been doing since, and some of that comes out of that mediation, in fact, which I'm delighted to see. But social media is a tool for us, not a drug for us to get caught up in. It's super useful. I mean, look at us now on screen. It's wonderful, but we just have to use it mindfully. And I guess maybe I'm a bit bruised by that mediation, which was really, really painful for everybody. But it was a lesson for us all, a learning curve for many of us of an age that never had it when we were growing up, but have got kids now who, if I can get my boys to put their phone down for at least half an hour when we're having dinner, I think I've had a successful evening. So it is what it is. So yeah, you're absolutely right. I think marketing's a really, I mean, and there's loads of people who are prepared to help you at cost, but I think most of us know ourselves best, and we know who we know in terms of people to go and knock on the door. And I've found that most people are more than happy to have a coffee with you. Nobody wants to have a lunch anymore. We're no longer in the world of the 80s, where I used to have a bottle of wine and a lovely lunch at least twice a week. We're all in the world where everybody has to count their hours. So a cup of coffee, I'm really brutal about it. I will put maybe a month in my diary where I come up to the city, and I make sure that those I haven't seen in the last 6 months, I'll pop and say hello. And I think that's just what we all have to do, just to keep our ideas before people, so that when they're thinking about mediators, they think about you. Obviously, it's much easier when you're in the chambers, and that's useful. Some of you will have done a course at Cedar or CRB or whatever. That those courses are really useful, and you can network through your group you're with. Some of those organisations have a limited amount of mediations they can hand out. Some have more. and you need to sort of navigate that through in terms of what's the art of the possible. There aren't that many chambers. I mean, obviously, brick court chambers have some mediators, and a number of other chambers have mediators now on their books. If you're not a barrister, that's difficult to get involved with. So where else do you go? It's really tough. It's really tough, but it takes time. And I think word of mouth is a tough old process, because you need to still be in people's mind's eyes. So marketing's not easy, but keeping in touch is really important. The last thing I would say on marketing that I found helpful, and I guess it's each to his own, is playing to your strengths. So where my experience at Bird and Bird was around IT and IP, my experience at DLA was around project management. That's what really, and I found what was very interesting was a lot of my PFI litigation and relationship fallout and joint ventures played into my roles when I moved to Bird and Bird, where actually the same projects, the big IT projects, had the same issues going on, relationships falling apart within 5 years of a 20-year relationship. How were you putting that together again? What were you getting from your commercial colleagues in terms of why it fell apart? Was it beyond the mend, or could you resurrect the relationship? If that was the case, what was the change control mechanisms in the contract looking like? Would mediation play a role in trying to find the financier, the operator, and the owner's interests aligned somehow in these three circles to get a new relationship going? There was real synergies between construction contracts, IT contracts, and then when I went to King's Boarding, almost all I was doing was energy contracts. But all of those had technology in it. All of those had big construction elements to it. There was so much mergers, but being able to talk the talk of those kind of sectors and having some degree of sector knowledge was really helpful in me hooking in mediations that had that kind of content. So maybe thinking of playing to your strengths, whatever regions you worked in, whatever sectors were your specialisms, whatever jargon you understood, making sure that maybe you do thought leadership articles within those sectors gives you something that stands you out amongst the others and gives you some kudos, some credibility in those fields. No one expects you to be an absolute specialist. That's what the lawyers are if they've been doing that day in, day out, or what their experts are. But having a knowledge of the subject matter of the dispute really, really helps. And so being sensible and clever about your CV so that you can mix and match when you are pitching for particular mediations to bring out the cases that are most relevant for the types of work that you're being asked to look at. That's probably enough on history and marketing. If I can now just reflect for the next 20 minutes and then perhaps, and do ask questions, I'd love to have this as a discussion. I was wanted to cover a couple of cases that I'm doing, or types of cases. I've also got to be careful. Sorry, Roger, you got your hand up. Or you're on mute.
Hello, has somebody got their hand up?
Yeah, Roger.
Yeah,
Roger, yeah, go on.
thank you, Jane. I mean, it's been really interesting and good to see you. Only because you asked for questions and comments. As I'm listening, I'm thinking there's a lot of people on this call who are non-lawyers who are starting out, and I'm just wondering what your encouragement and advice is for them.
Yeah,
Good
it's a good question.
question.
And forgive me, I'm not a non-lawyer, so I can only say as much as I can say. But there's been some very successful non-lawyers who've become mediators. They are less of them, but doesn't mean it's not possible to do. And you've only got to look at someone like Mark Jackson Stocks, who's made a fantastic business of his mediation career. It's very, very doable. And a lot of it is networking. I mean, even if you're not a lawyer, you will know lawyers because of your background, because you're interested in mediation, you will be involved in it. And obviously you've got that sector knowledge in spades. So those comments are, you have to sculpt your path, your journey to play to your strengths. If you try to pretend to be what you're not, you get found out. We all do. But if you play to your strengths of what you can offer, I often say the commercial client partners are better in mediations than the litigators, because and I had to train myself out of this. As a litigation lawyer, my role is to fight for my client. and I see it time and time again as a mediator, you're just too close to the party's interests to be able to see and guide them into a settlement. And it's your arguments that are being tested and are being challenged on the other side. So you have a role to play. So there's a lot to be said for non-litigation mediators. But I fully understand that the marketplace tends to want to see someone who can do the risk management, the risk analysis with the parties, which if you're a litigation lawyer, you can put to them what the what and the BATNA is, perhaps in a little bit more synergy with the lawyers. So it's a balancing act, but you've got to play to your strengths. Thanks, Roger. Good question. So let me just go on to cases, and then there's please throw some questions at me. I also want to just touch on some exciting new stuff that I'm doing, or stuff that I've been wanting to do for years that are finally coming about, which is around dispute avoidance mechanisms using mediation. And I know Michael and I have talked for probably the last 15 years about deal mediation, in life mediation, I call it, standing mediators for dispute avoidance. I'm really seeing that growing, and that's terribly exciting, I think. But the sort of cases that I've been involved in, and the things that I pick out in terms of learning curves for me, and almost the psychological role we play as mediators, a lot of the work I do is around projects that fall apart, so joint ventures projects. And a lot of what I see, particularly in the larger projects, are overcoming the anger and the embarrassment of the project not succeeding. And we often talk as mediators about who should come into the room. You can't not have those people in the room because it's their baby that's gone wrong. But you really, really need to have somebody alongside them that can be the voice of reason and can get them beyond the anger or the frustration or the embarrassment that the deal hasn't happened. I've been doing one just recently around huge joint venture capitalist companies that came on board for a renewable project, really state-of-the-art renewable project. And as we all know, you'll have people that are in, this is around renewable energy. So these guys that are producing these new systems that are trying to get around the fracking issues or whatever it might be to bring out geothermal stuff, they're real inventors, they're geologists, they're really clever guys. But this is very state-of-the-art, very edge technology where things are always happening slower than they want it to happen. And then you've got venture capitalists who are really out in the market looking for money. And so their reputation in terms of going to pension funds, going to these big boys to get money in, they put their neck on the line trying to get that. When this doesn't happen, or when the project doesn't happen quickly enough, or the inventors, the guys that are the technologists, don't really help the financiers get the money in, and it all falls apart. You've got really sophisticated money boys who are really cross because they've been slightly embarrassed. They spent a year bringing people to the table, and it falls apart. And they're angry. They're really angry, and they think that they would have made serious amount of money out of this. And then you've got the other guys trying to manage that psychology to get them to be in the right space before they mediate is hugely important. And I think I'm probably spending more time with those kind of mediations, suggesting that we sculpt the mediation. You'll hear me say that word a few times, to have a lot more prep time with them so that I can get them in the right space. I'm doing one with a tax consultancy, which has got 72 countries, tax consultants who are under one umbrella of an alliance, and the egos in each jurisdiction and the ability to get them just to talk to each other has taken me a month just to get them into the one Zoom room for us to have a conversation around how this alliance is going to move forward, working with the OECD and the European Union. So understanding the psychology, I've almost feel like I've become a little bit of a psychologist versus the mediator, just to get people into the right space to begin the conversation. A very similar circumstance happened with another mediation, which is still ongoing, so I need to be careful how I describe it. But here we've got Koreans who have taken over some IP, where you've got Europeans who've been licensees running the product and the brand for a number of years, because prior to the purchase of the brand by the Koreans, some US, again, money boys had it and didn't interfere at all. Although they were the IP owners, they were happy to let the Europeans run the brand the way they wanted to. Scroll forward, the Koreans have taken it on. They're very clever at being able to develop brands. We all know this, and you can see how brilliant Korea is in terms of their content management on brands. And they have very different ideas. But actually, this is all around the way they did it and how they didn't think through the mindset of East versus West, and the arrogance of the Europeans thinking they've been doing it brilliantly for ages, and this IP owner should really love them because of what they're doing, as opposed to understanding the change in direction. So I think that all of those things tell me that those kind of big ticket cases, which we're now getting more of because the big law firms are seeing the benefit of mediation, and because they're being pressed to do so by the court, require us to be more of a psychologist as well as a mediator, and the prep time is increasing. The other thing I wanted to mention was negligence cases. Really interesting, doing a whole bunch of stuff around solicitors, accountants. I'm just doing one with ship surveyors at the moment. The temptation I'm seeing is professionals try to do too much. They love their clients and they try to extend themselves beyond their remit, beyond their terms of engagement, beyond their brief, either because they know the client too well and they bend over backwards to try to help them, but they acquire far too much responsibility. They raise the expectations of their clients. When things go wrong, of course, they hand it to their insurers. Their insurers go back to their terms of engagement letters, which they issued way before. And then you have this story, the story of the scope creep of the negligence, and how much acquiring of responsibility did they take on versus what the contract said and what the client expected. It told me a lesson: you should never mix friends with work, and not going too close to the clients. And I think there's a whole piece around, as a mediator, understanding the role in the room of the individual who's being accused of being negligent versus the insurers who are trying to protect both the individual and, oh, just a minute, 2 seconds, my dog's being grabbed. Hang on. Go. Sorry about that. My dog won't leave me until he sees the dog walker. And then so you've got this whole piece around insurers who want to protect the firm because that's their policy holder. The individual needs caressing because it's a horrible thing for any of us to go through. We all should go through it once to understand how horrible it is to be accused of professionally not doing a good job. It's you've got to manage that, because that can be not just case destroying, but actually life destroying for an individual. And you only got to see that in terms of surgeons, negligence cases, but equally so solicitors who all their life have wanted to do good and something's gone wrong. And of course, sadly, people are more and more now accusing professionals of doing the wrong thing. So you've got that whole piece going on. I mean, I've got a case at the moment where I've got just finished in Guernsey, a 3-day case where we've got professional directors who've acted for a joint venture. But this one individual has been a director of both shareholder companies and the JV vehicle. And his actions are clearly, inevitably conflicted. And the accusations are that he acted for the benefit of one shareholder to the detriment of the other by transferring all his shares. And then, you can hear the argument there, and not making any judgment on it. But the difficulty was in the mediation, we had the JV vehicle had been put into liquidation. So we had hard-nosed Guernsey liquidators who were just trying to work out what this director had done. And in the other room, we had the professional company that had the directors working, and they do it for a living, together with their insurers. So insurers and liquidators having a ding dong, because effectively it was their pocket and it was their claim, and the liquidators were being funded. So actually we'd moved an awful long way away from what that director had or hadn't done. And luckily he'd retired, so he wasn't in the room to be shouted at. But what were we doing in that mediation? We were actually trying to work out completely risk management around what should they or shouldn't they have done, what could they or couldn't they have done, and whether the liquidator really had a claim. He wanted to close off the books of the liquidation. but he could see an asset in terms of litigation, and the insurers were keen to close off the litigation by paying something, albeit not quite as much as the liquidator wanted. But over the day, ultimately, you put the hard-nosed boys together and you got the deal, and the deal was done. It was always more than someone wanted to pay and always less than someone wanted to receive, but ultimately, pragmatically, better than litigation. So the insurer liquidator piece, I think, is also interesting, and it happens, and it's the same again for funders. More and more of the big cases that we're mediating has a funder standing by. It's a nightmare if you've got this, if you get to it too late as a mediator. There's way too much conflict of interest with law fees and funders upsides to manage. But I spend quite a bit of time talking to the funders because I'm keen to understand as a mediator what motivates the funders. And it was interesting for me to understand that funders get more money if they settle early. Their model is based on they will gain more by settling early. So there's no way that a funder is getting in the way of a mediation. That's good news. We can talk about whether funders should or shouldn't come to mediations, and I'd love your views. But I really think that they're not a bad thing to have there. We used to say barristers were bad to be in mediations. I think they're now wonderful because they're all being trained and they all wear different hats. And I specifically asked them to wear different hats. But same for funders. They're not in it to fund cases through to the end. They'll make more money to settle. So that was another observation on those cases.
Actually, Jane, I was just going to chip in. I was just wondering whether you encountered something I've encountered sometimes, and that is where perhaps a joint venture or a licensing agreement is working perfectly well, and then there's a change of ownership or change of control on one party, and then the whole thing, the whole relationship completely breaks down because maybe the new owners of one of the businesses, one of the parties, actually sees this opportunity to try and grab more money.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you almost have a mediation within a mediation.
Yep.
Because you have a strategy, and then the strategy has to change because somebody else comes in, and you see that with entrepreneurs. It's very interesting. I think you've got somebody who's got a real influence over. If you've got a very sensible corporate and a board decision who's got a strategy in place, then a new person normally acquires the strategy. But where you have more flexible enterprises, where you have entrepreneurial individuals who have got much more say, they can change the direction completely, and that completely disrupts, sometimes for the good. But recognizing who's influencing who is obviously, as we all know, so key. But I keep going back to this. And this is my last piece, is my future gazing, and I'm recognizing the time, so I'll be really quick about it. We have to, as mediators, all our training should be around flexibility, should be around sculpting something, making sure that our process that we are suggesting, because we are the process managers, fit the fuss that we're being presented with. So the more we can get to it early and understand what the problem is all about, the more able we are to really design a process that might need much more preparation. And what I've just done took us 6 weeks to get us to a 2-day mediation, and we had a good, I think I probably had about 10 meetings, Zoom meetings, because they were international characters. They were going to fly in for the mediation for 2 days, but we had 10 meetings, 5 each with each side, understanding what they needed in the mediation, what processes. This was the Korean and European collaboration. It really required me to think very differently. Right back in my Bird and Bird days as an advisor, I actually was really lucky enough to be involved in sculpting a mediation process for the European Union. There was a merger of 2 telecoms companies, and as you know, the Competition Commission weren't going to let them merge unless there was some kind of process to get the agreement reflective not just of the parties' needs, but of the third-party telecoms companies who might be influenced by the merger. And because Bird and Bird are so amazing in terms of telecoms, we suggested to the European Union that we did it by way of a quasi-mediation. So we sculpted a mediation where we had, it's a bit like a dispute board, but it wasn't, because it wasn't decision-making. But we had 3 individuals who we chose for their expertise in telecoms, but also their law expertise. We had the 2 merging parties, and then we had this third. We had 3 telecoms companies who had relationships with either party who would be affected by the merger. and we were confined to a 6-week period because that was the European Union requirement. But in that 6 weeks, we designed between us all a process of making an agreement where we got to a clause where we thought there would be an influence for the third party, we got their input, and we put both versions of the clause we wanted as parties to the mediators, and they didn't decide, but they helped us find a way through to a clause that would satisfy our needs as parties, but also reflect the third party needs so that we could present it to the European Union and get approval. I mean, that was just so exciting. And that was when I was a lawyer. So I brought that to me with being a mediator. And when I get really difficult, you can see that this is not just going to be a normal one-dayer. You can say, okay, please, let's get together. Let's hold the date, push it back by 3 months and design it properly. It's worth it. There's millions involved. It's worth designing a process that will reflect upon what we need to do. The more I'm seeing much more preparation prior to mediation day. There's nothing worse than being a mediator that gets papers the day before. You get in there, we've all done it, and you realise that if only you'd had the papers 2 weeks before, you could have asked for. I mean, we had one where it was all about quantum, and both of them had not really hot tubbed their experts. And one expert was saying it's 20 million, and one expert said it was -5. It was so far apart. There's no way the lawyers could deal with that on the day. And I kept saying to them, can we please hot tub them? I hadn't thought. I know I hadn't thought because one side kept refusing. I said, let's just get them to have a Zoom for an hour before we mediate the day before and tell us what do they agree on and what don't they? And then we can mediate the bits that we need to mediate. Why wouldn't they do it? I couldn't work it out. And of course, it's because there were insurers involved and they'd already had their reserve meeting. They'd had their reserve meeting 4 days before the mediation. So it didn't matter what their expert told them in terms of risk. They only had a certain amount they could play with. So what's the point of having experts spend money hot tubbing the day before? Now, we'd had those papers 2 weeks before, and if I'd had my calls 2 weeks before or a week before, we could have persuaded those insurers to do it. Because what happened on the mediation day? We realised we had to pause to let the experts hot tub. I mean, frustrating. So if we can only encourage people to give us papers early, we can help them sculpt the mediation to fit the fuss. That's my first thought. My last thought is deal mediation. Really, really want all of us to try to get into organisations, not the advisors who are thinking litigation, but companies, London Chamber of Commerce, businesses around. If you are going into a long-term project, you are going to have bumps in the road. If you're going to have bumps in the road, you need to have a mechanism whereby you don't just run off to your lawyers and to your contract, because we all know that the majority of contracts, the majority of projects within a year of the contract being signed, bear no relationship to the contract anymore. So there's an artifice in going to lawyers who then look for a clause they can claim has been breached. And therein lies a polarization of a problem. And this project, which is really important to both parties, starts to go wobbly. If we can only get in earlier and use our skills as dispute avoidance advisors, become trusted advisors, trusted neutrals to the project when they're in love, when they're still in harmony, and have a mechanism where they both understand us and trust us. I always do what I call a memorandum of understanding between the parties. I'm not prepared to do rights and obligations. I leave that to the lawyers. I ask them to say, tell me why you're in bed with these guys. What are they offering you that you haven't got? And you tell me what you need from them and what you might offer. And if you can write that down in a memorandum of understanding, that's my document. I go off, pay me. But when things go wrong, in your contract, you've agreed for a 90-day pause period. That's essential, because if you don't do that, lawyers won't let you stop because you've got milestones to reach. In an IT, in an energy, in a construction project, everyone has milestones and they're terrified of missing them or being accused of missing them. So they fudge along with problems rather than dealing with them. Get a pause period so everyone is in mode of trying to resolve. Bring the neutral in then. And all I'm prepared to look at is my memorandum. I don't want to know what the contract says. I want to know what the memorandum and bring people back in to collaborating together to solve the issues. And boy, does it work. I'm doing one with an amazing Swiss company who've got this fantastic blood product. They designed it in the war when apparently the Red Cross had leftover blood. Who knew? But they actually from that extracted certain elements of it and made it. And they've got a most amazing business, but they're based in Zurich. They're a family business and they're very much tight because they're a family business and they work in a certain way. But to take their business to the next stage, they needed investment. And a wonderful Californian company wants to invest, but they're terrified of that cultural mismatch. And so they brought me in as their neutral to help. And I would say I've got 4 of these. Only one has ever used me because because you've got the mechanism, you don't have the problems. It's really interesting. So deal mediation, in life mediation, standing mediation is something where we're moving our skills up the food chain to look at dispute avoidance. For me, that's the next stage where mediation will really have a role to play, and all of our skills in this room will be used more and more. And I'm quite excited about that. And I'm just beginning to see it happening, and we couldn't be at a better time to be involved in it. I'll shush because it's 9:45. Any questions? I'd love to discuss with you.
Well, Jane, yeah, just hang on. In the sidebar, we've got a question for Jane. It says, "How is cultural?" Oh, I've lost it now. Just a minute. Just bear with me a sec.
Was that from Carl?
Or how is cultural understanding gleaned given an even increasing
That's it.
device of
That's the
world?
one. Yeah.
Do you know, I think
How do you prepare for it?
I went on an incredibly interesting course on cultural understanding, and we, as a lawyer running divisions at Bird and Bird, where we had different law firms, you realize the Germans look at things differently from the Italians so you have to have that appreciation of not everyone sees things down the telescope the same way as you do. But that doesn't mean you can't resolve things. In fact, sometimes it can allow you to just pause and say, could you tell me how you perceived what we said to you? And you unravel a bit you had no idea about that caused the dispute or the issue that arose. So there's a lot of learning, a lot of teaching around this, but there's very so one of the things I always do with Asian parties, for example, and Michael, I'm sure you do the same thing, is they will very rarely make a decision on the day. And so I always build in an extra day where we have a day off. And I find, particularly with the Koreans and the Asians, they will take on board what's been said on the day and they will do the deal the following day quietly with the other side without me being around. I don't care. If they've got a deal, good by me. So there's a whole piece around giving people an ability to be able to. We did a big dispute between Turkish and Korean automobile franchise. And that was my lesson. That was my lesson learned. That we didn't solve it on the day, but it settled the following day. And I wanted to know why. And it was all around just giving them time to do it without having to embarrass them or confront things. And so that's really important to them. And that's help. And then you have to help. For example, we did one with the Americans and a Middle East party where the Americans turned up for a day, and I said to them, you need 3 or 4 days, and on the first day all we're going to do is going to have a meal with them, and then perhaps on day 2 or 3 we will have the mediation. And they weren't prepared to do it. They flew in, flew out. They had a 3-hour gap, they said. I said, it's not going to happen. If you don't understand the people to whom you are negotiating, that's probably why the problem happened in the first place, but it's certainly the reason why you're not going to get a mediated settlement. So as a mediator, the more we can learn, read, and understand cultural differences, the more able you are to guide your parties that are coming to the mediation to do it in a way that is going to give you the best chance of the settlement. And that's all we can do as a mediator, make the environment the most fertile for people to have respectful conversations that are not just the way you do it.
Okay, who else have we got? Who else wants to say something? Ask a question.
Can you hear me? It's Philip
hand.
Wallace.
Oh,
Who we got?
Philip Wallace.
Yeah, Philip. Hello. Go ahead.
Hi. Morning, Jen. I'll be brief, but I'm one. I know Roger, and Roger probably had me as one of a few in mind of saying we're non-professional or non-legal mediators. But I come from a business background, and I come from a business background of being a principal where I've been in multi-jurisdictional disputes, offshore, construction, tax, you name it, and the law is. But I came into mediation because of my 15-year experience of going through the exercise. Your colleague Jonathan Lloyd-Jones mediated on one or two situations. So I've come into it for that reason, because I see a different perspective perhaps on how this is going. And I've got two quick questions for you actually, which are quite practical. We know that the courts are mandating alternative dispute resolution. It's becoming, the thing to do. The real letdown for me is that the courts never get to understand the conduct of the parties in that mediation, the willingness, the appetite. So what I experience personally, and I think there will be more and more of this, is parties going to mediation just to say that they've been to mediation, but actually without any intention of mediating. Do you see that as a problem, and do you see any situation where the courts will start to be fed back, not a lot of the detail, but the principles?
Two things to that. Firstly, absolutely not. And I think we as mediators are very, very keen that people don't unpick our process, because the very magic of our process is the confidentiality. And if we can't create an environment where people can sound off and speak and say what they want to say, we won't get settlements. And I absolutely do not want anybody to unravel whether people are bona fide or not. The second point is, my experience is I often get that, particularly with the big law firms. They tell me how they're going to mediate. They tell me what I'm going to do. They don't want the plenary. They don't want this. They don't want that. And you just listen quietly, and then you explain to them that actually there's absolutely no point in appointing me as a mediator who does this week in, week out, and then tell me how to do my process. They've got to trust me, just like I'm going to trust them to behave properly on the day. And loads of people tell me that they can't quite see why they're mediating and they're only doing it through process. And yet, the dynamic of the day gets them talking. And once they start talking, and once they try to persuade the other side that their case is absolutely watertight, and then they hear from the other side a respectful law firm, maybe a KC, say they don't see it the same way, and more importantly, their clients listen to it, the day unfolds in a very, very different manner. So I would say I've got at least 5 or 6 examples that I can think of straight away where I have people telling me that at the beginning, telling me there's no need for a plenary, telling me they don't even need to give me position papers because I might just read the pleadings. And I used to get really upset and try to persuade them, and now I'm a bit war weary, and I get them in the room, or I have that pre-call and I explain to them what the process is that they've bought into, and more often than not, you get movement. So answer is absolutely not to the first bit. And secondly, you can work around it. Your business experience will tell you people say an awful lot when they're not facing someone across the table. What they've got to do is face each other across the table, say what they want to say, and listen to what the other side's got to say in return. And it happens. We know it all happens. That's why we love being mediators.
I've got one more.
Yeah,
Sorry, can I just ask one?
Yeah, hang on.
Sorry.
You've had a fair old say, Philip. I was just going to say that I went a while back to an ICC conference, and we had a mock arbitration actually, and then they had a mock settlement conference, which was very realistic. Some continental people doing this, and the case didn't settle during the settlement conference, and I put up my hand and said, well, what are you going to say about that in the arbitration award? And they said nothing. Next question. And that's to your point. These sort of processes almost need to retain their magic. Now, we got George Culverhouse had his hand up, I think.
Hi, George.
Hello, thank you, Michael, and yeah, thanks, Shane. It's been great.
Keep it brief and ask a question rather than making a statement.
Absolutely.
That's okay.
So
Carry
my
on.
question is around the in-life stuff. So I'm a project manager. I come from that part of non-legal expertise. So the timing piece of 90-day pause, I sense as probably one element of resistance from certain sides of projects or clients. What other resistance do you see for people, and maybe even the people who are doing projects who aren't even aware that there is a sort of project mediation type role that exists? What resistance do you see, or do you see, have you experienced over your time in those kind of roles?
Great question. And as a lawyer, we used to try to train people to do dawn raid preparation. And because you need to know what you're going to do when the regulator knocks on the door. You could never get parties to pay for that as lawyers. It used to really frustrate you. And the best people have the best governance of people who've been already bitten once. And you're so right. It's really difficult to tell somebody, like in a marriage, just in case things go wrong, let's put something in place. So when you're in harmony and it all seems very rosy, it's very, very unlikely that people think that they should have. That's why dispute resolution clauses are the last in and the first to be looked at. People don't spend enough time thinking. And it requires sophistication by the parties that are entering into it. And ironically, where you have cross-cultural get-togethers, it's more acute because of the fear factor. So the fear factor leads you to do it. So, I mean, you're absolutely spot on, and that's why there aren't enough of them yet. It's encouraging parties to be really, and often it's because a JV's gone wrong in the past, that they might be open to it. But I also think it's getting hold of people like Philip, the business people, because they know that there are going to be blips. That I can't think of any project that doesn't have a blip from time to time. And it's not the blip, it's how you manage the blip. And if you can pay for a third party, and then it costs a tenth, less than a tenth of the project itself. And if it actually stops things going into litigation, which is then a serious pause and serious cost, why wouldn't you do it? But you're absolutely right. It's selling it upstream when life is rosy and they think, oh, we'll deal with that when it happens. It's not on their horizon. So I did some really interesting training with Total in France. Now, they are so ahead of the game. They have a massive training outfit just outside of Paris. And I was brought in as a mediator to train not just their in-house lawyers, but their business people. And that's really interesting because then suddenly, their lawyers are not seen as the no merchants, which often in-house lawyers are seen as. The business understand what the lawyers are trying to do, and the lawyers understand what the business are trying to do. And between them, they could see the logic of in-house sounding mediators. But it's that sell factor to people when they're harmonious, and it tends to happen to people who've already been bitten once. So you're spot
Got
on.
it.
Spot on.
Thanks.
Okay. Who else have we got? Anybody else? Philip, did you have another question then, briefly?
Sorry, I did actually, yes.
Yeah, carry on.
Thank you. So sorry, Jane, this is going to sound very cynical, particularly with you being an ex-litigation lawyer, but it's an honest question, which is why are lawyers motivated for their clients to settle at mediation when litigation fees are so expensive that, you know, by going all the way through the court process, lawyers benefit far more?
I'm a reformed litigator, and I do hear you on this. And look, it is difficult. And I obviously I'm acutely aware, having been in a US law firm where hours are important, and we all give our budgets, and we all say we've got four cases going to trial this year, so it should be budgeted at X, Y, Z. And then suddenly the client says, well, I might like to settle. You think, oh no, I've got a whole stream of assistants that I was going to give work to for the next 6 months, and I've got this. I get it. That's the model of law firms. To be fair, lots of law firms have tried with their clients to do different types of billing, and clients are to blame on this because more often than not, we would spend days putting together innovative fee structures, and ultimately clients, the one metric they can compare one law firm to another is the hourly rate. So you go round and round in circles, I'm afraid. So I think there's a little bit of fault on both sides, and we are where we are. But the truth also is that, as I often say, as a litigator, when I won an amazing case, I would have a client say to me, God, that was amazing, Jane. Thank you so much. But please don't get me wrong. If I never see you again, that's a good day. That is not marketing for a litigator. If you can get a client out of a problem early doors, then yes, okay, you may have only made half of what you'd hope to make through trial. But if they then go back to their office and they go back to that filing cabinet, they get another horrible file out that they didn't want to look at, and they go, I wonder if Jane could sort that one out as well. That's marketing. So we have to understand, how does a litigator market? You know, you can't sell snow to a Eskimo. We have to think about risk management. And litigators, I was always trying to tell my team, go and talk to businesses before they've got a dispute. Become the old-fashioned trusted advisor, because when the proverbial hits the fan, you want to be the person that they want to talk to. They are not going to pick up the phone to a litigator they've never met before saying, I've got a bet the business problem on my hands. They're only going to talk to you if you've built up some marketing with them around risk. Go and have a chat to a client and say, tell me your 5-year plan. Talk to me through what you're going to do for the next 5 years, and I'll give you free some legal risk advice on what you might come across. And then together, we might be able to formulate some dispute avoidance mechanism. It might be key man management. I might bring my IP colleagues in and protect you in relation to some of that IP you're creating. But during that time, you as a litigator are becoming their trusted advisor. So you're spot on, but the lawyer needs to think in a different way. If you just love being a fighter and you're just a litigator in Red Claw, you're a nightmare for me, because you're going to come in and just fight a battle. You've not changed your hat. So yes, there's a little bit of conflict of interest. Of course there is. No one will say there's not, but of course we know there is. We've got to work within that and encourage lawyers to see that settling early is also marketing. It just breaks open a client's war chest of other things to do. Does that help?
It does, Jane. It's not a perfect world, but
It isn't. Yeah.
It's
They're trying to make a living. They're trying to make a living.
It's an informed answer, and thank you very much.
Okay. We're almost approaching the bewitching hour of 10 o'clock. Anybody else want to ask a question?
Gerard.
Here we go. Gerard.
Hi, Jane.
Go ahead.
Hearty question to finish on. What's the strangest or weirdest place you've ever mediated? Because we do get to go to some strange places sometimes.
I have mediated in a pub. That was the funny situation where this guy was so nervous. I knew he had to go and have a pint. So I sent him down to have a pint with his lawyer and told him, but only one, please. Didn't want him to come back, not able to make some decisions. Certainly, I mean, on site is often quite interesting. And so often you get, I mean, I worked in a builder's, a working cabin with one convector heater. That's been a bit annoying. Where else have I mediated that's been funny? I have actually mediated once on a beach. That was sort of uncomfortable and for reasons of culture had to happen on the outside. But most of the time it's solicitors' offices, which some are great and some are awful.
I did one in a flat recently on the banks of the River Thames, and we had to test the acoustics for confidentiality. So we closed door, sent somebody into it was actually a bedroom that was going to be the mediator's room. It became known as the boudoir, which lightened the mood slightly. And we closed all the doors, and I got him to start shouting to see where the main room was. He could be overheard, and he had to shout really loud to hear anything. The acoustics were good, but within 5 minutes there was a knock on the door from a neighbour going, "Is everything all right? I thought there was a murder."
Yeah, well, there you go. There you go.
Okay.
I did once have, I mean, talking about anger, I did have two builders who'd fallen out with each other on a project, and we couldn't even start because they were spitting feathers. So I actually took them psychologically out of that mediation room and put them in another room. And I said, right, you just need to have a showdown in terms of how you're both feeling. I'm staying here. There's 2 rules. You can't hit each other and you can't hit me. And you've got 10 minutes. And it was just incredible. I mean, there were words I'd never even knew existed come out of their mouths. What was interesting in doing that, though, was to just get the air out. Because actually, it was a bit like watching 2 of my sons fighting. Ultimately, they ran out of punches. They ran out of things to say. And then you just said to them, no one else is going to touch that project. Nobody. Only you 2 know where all the wires are. Let's get back in there and work it out. And they did. So, this goes right back to the very beginning, and the topic for here: sculpt everything. Think about where you're best. Where are you best? Is it too difficult to be where the site of the problem is? Are you better removing them, or do you need to be there? I mean, is a particular environment? If you've got a husband and wife relationship, is a solicitor's office too formal? Does that get people to a point where they freeze and they can't speak clearly? Really, really important to choose who's there and where to be. So you're spot on. I mean, we've got to think. We can't just have one size fits all. And we probably need to think about our financial model too. We can't just say, here's a fixed fee. I'm going to give you 5 hours prep. It's going to be 2 calls and an 8-hour day. Boom. It doesn't always work like that. Lots of our cases do, but not all of them. And we just need to be thoughtful.
And it's all so right. It's all emotionally driven. I mean, the reason I was in a flat was it was a 4 brothers and sisters family dispute over some property, and the flat belonged to a family friend who was very close to them. So all being in a neutral space but family connected made them relax a little bit. So,
Yeah,
they actually
absolutely.
didn't want. I've got great solicitors' offices. I can give you a great deal. They're really cheap. But no, we don't want that. We want somewhere that connects with us as human beings.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Dave is now going to invite people who are attending for the first time, the so-called newbies, to introduce them, probably about half a dozen of them. Then Dave will say something about our next meeting, which will be around this time in January, just before, but everybody's welcome to stay on for, I don't know, half an hour and have a bit of a chat. Jane, you're welcome to stay as long as you like. There's one thing I was going to mention which may be of interest, and that is the Worshipful Company of Arbitrators don't just think they do arbitration, by the way, and Keating Chambers are holding a symposium called Arbitration ADR Your Role on the 4th of December. If you go on, I've got it here. If you, I don't know, Martin, you might be able to put it up. If you go onto the Keating Chambers website, and there are going to be people there from, I think, CEDA and in other words, various of the appointing institutions involved in ADR generally are going to be there and talk about, well, how do you get your first appointment? How do you get more appointments? And so on. So that might be of interest. So it's a bit difficult to applaud Jane, but no doubt if we were all in person, we would show our appreciation
Thank you.
in the usual way. That was a great kind of canter through your own career and how you handled things. Absolutely fascinating. You're obviously doing very, very well, which is and really enjoying it, which is great to see. So thank you very much. You're welcome to come back every time, I could probably say.